Hi guys, it's Geekonomics here. So now I'm bringing you Extract 1 on the F585 pre-release material. So Extract 1, UK in the vanguard of recovery, but the Chancellor sounds a note of caution. So let's just have a very first brief look at this. So you can see, ladies and gentlemen, without even getting into this in too much detail, we're talking real GDP, consumer prices, unemployment. Now the key thing here is, of course, we need to match this with the area of the specification which it is likely to be assessing. So let me just bring up your copy of the specification. This is it here. F585, the global economy. Now, Extract 1 focuses on this area here, the very first section, macroeconomic performance. Doesn't always happen like this, that the first extract mirrors this first portion of the specification, but in this case that is the case. And these are all the things, obviously, that candidates should be able to do. And we can use this to help us identify what the likely questions might be. So I'll come back to this at the end of this particular video, and we'll have a look and see what the particular questions might be on this particular extract. But let's have a more detailed look at this particular extract. So let's read through, and we'll stop at various points and just break it down. By the end of 2015, it was clear that the UK, in addition to the USA, was in the vanguard of recovery. So the vanguard meaning one of the leading nations of recovery from the recession, 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. Economic growth was faster than that achieved by other developed economies. Unemployment had fallen significantly. Employment had reached the highest level since records began. So you'll be familiar, I'm sure, with the introductory phase of macroeconomics in A level, where the key things that we look at are the key macro objectives of the government: low and stable inflation, favourable trade balance, sustainable economic growth, low unemployment. And here we have, in the first little section of the specification, we have a few of these things mentioned already: economic growth, employment. And obviously here we've got something to do with inflation. So if you flick back into the specification, you can see that these are all aspects which are being considered in this first section. So inflation, employment, unemployment, government's fiscal position, all referenced here and all mentioned in the very early stages of this initial extract. The fiscal deficit had also been reduced somewhat. Okay, let's have a little bit of a more in-depth look at the fiscal deficit. So I've talked about this on the introductory video, but if you haven't watched it, let's just mention what we mean by the fiscal deficit. DEFICIT, by the way, was one of the most commonly misspelled words in economics, deficit. So what do we mean by fiscal deficit? Fiscal policy, as you know, is G&T, government spending, taxation. You'll know that if G is greater than T, then that is referred to as a budget deficit, which would be considered to be an expansionary fiscal policy. G is less than T, you'll know that that's a budget surplus, which would be a contractionary, and if G is equal to T, then that's something known as a balanced budget. And indeed a balanced budget is also expansionary, for reasons which we'll not get into here, but you can find that in one of my other videos. So, the fiscal deficit. Now it says on your pre-release extract material, it says, very carefully there, look what it says, has been reduced somewhat. This word somewhat is very important, because if we have a look here, this is the website ukpublicspending.co.uk. If we look at the budget deficit from 2010 onwards, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, And you can see this is an estimated figure on this particular website for 2016. So it's looking around just the 40 billion mark. Now, when the coalition government of David Cameron and Nick Clegg got into power, one of the first things that they said that they would tackle would be to bring down this enormous fiscal deficit here, which was around about 110 billion, something like that. And you can see that in the face of quite difficult circumstances, given that the global economy was in a state of flux and coming out of this horrendous global recession, the Great Recession, as referenced by Joseph Stiglitz, it has come down. You can see here to here to here to here to here. The general trend is downwards. However, it's still fairly significant, this budget deficit. And why is it important to bring something like that under control? Well, a few reasons really. Number one, in order to finance a deficit, the government has to borrow. So there is an opportunity cost element there, in the sense that interest has to be paid on any borrowings, of course. And the government issues gilts or bonds in order to finance this borrowing. Every time you borrow, you obviously are rolling up money which is being snowballed onto your already enormous, massive debt. Now that enormous, massive debt we of course refer to as the national debt, which in this country is knocking on for around 1.6, 1.7 trillion pounds. So it's important from that point of view, because you want to, once you start bringing this under control, you can then start to tackle the bigger problem, which is of course the country's national debt. It's interesting, on this particular website, a few interesting things. So if we wanted to join the euro, for example, all countries who wish to join the euro, what part of their joining criterion is that you must have your fiscal deficit less than 3% of your GDP, 3% or less. Well, you can see that when Clegg and Cameron came in, it was all, knocking on for 7%. It's just unsustainable. So something had to be done about it. And so it's 2015 there, almost down to the 3%. 2016, although that's an estimated figure, I don't think it's quite as low as that. If you look in the back pages of The Economist, for example, you'll see it's just over the 3% mark. So as a percentage of GDP, it's important to get that under control. And then here we can see in the deficit since the World War II, so all these periods here where we're above zero, this is indicative of a deficit, and these periods here, this is surplus. So these are times when you can be either saving for the future or paying down any debt. And you can see really how the early noughties was a terrible time for the UK, in that the borrowing just got out of hand, and so that had to come down. So that is why, ladies and gentlemen, it's talking about it being brought under control somewhat in your extract material. Okay. However, the pickup in economic activity had not yet exerted any upward pressure on inflation. Now, this is important because in our traditional thinking on economic theory, we would obviously be thinking to ourselves, okay, we're here at Y1, this is our full employment level of output, so if we're nowhere near full employment, we've got lots of unemployment here at Y1. But as we move around, and maybe AD gets to AD2, as we hit that capacity point, and capacity is reached in certain sectors of the economy, then that builds inflationary pressure into the economy. So that could be in the form of either wage inflation, price inflation, or both. So it's interesting that in your extract material, it's talking about achieving economic growth, yet not having that upward pressure on inflation, which remains stubbornly below its target range. Now, those of you who participated in the Bank of England's Target 2.0 competition, you will know that the target for inflation is 2%. And indeed, although it's still not above that, you'll know that it's CPI numbers, for example, in the UK reached 1.8%, just published figure the last week. Well, that's the highest it's been since 2014, I believe. So we're moving towards target. There are all sorts of reasons why it hasn't hit target, which we'll come on to. Indeed, prices fell. Now you'll know, I'm sure, that falling prices is of course known as deflation. Just on that point of deflation and inflation and so on, when you are interpreting obviously charts such as this, and let's say we were at a price level here of P2, and then AD fell to AD3 and we ended up at price level P3. Do not make the mistake of saying, okay, that is a reduction in prices in the economy. It simply means that prices are rising but at a slower rate. So it's similar to having, if you've got a chart here with inflation, you're asked to interpret, compare data or something. So point A has inflation, point B has inflation. It simply means that inflation was rising more quickly and prices were rising faster at A than they were at B. It's only once we get to C that the economy would experience falling price levels in that respect. Okay, so now then we're presented with this data and this table. So let's have a little bit of a look at this then. So for the UK, you can see quite a rosy picture really. So real GDP, so that's obviously real GDP with the inflation element stripped out of it, so that we know that all of this is growth of output, nothing is left to chance here. We know this is growth of output, not maybe growth of output and maybe growth of prices, or a combination of both, all growth of output. And pretty much on trend for what we would expect long term in the UK economy. Consumer prices rising per annum at these particular rates, and again below target as previously mentioned. Then unemployment nicely falling, 6.3, 5.6, 5.4, so unemployment rates coming down. So one would think, looking at that, quite a nice set of data when compared with some of the other economies on this chart, for example. So Italy, for example, with regard to growth numbers, consumer prices in Spain, falling prices, a couple of years on the trot there. And look at some of the unemployment data here, 24%, 22%, 20%. Spain, you'll all be aware, I'm sure, of the horrendous, particularly problems with youth unemployment in these economies, particularly Spain actually. So, it's an interesting set of data. I don't think there's anything else much to say about it really, but we can see that we have got unemployment falling and not that upward pressure on prices which we've talked about. And again, don't forget your Phillips curve analysis of the sort of trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So Phillips curve 1, unemployment, inflation. Traditional theory would be if you want to reduce the level of unemployment, move this way. You've got to accept that you'll incur some higher inflation as a consequence. And so this data set is saying, well actually, unemployment's falling, but yet we're not getting this inflationary build into the economy. And so what might the reasons be for that? Okay, next paragraph. No room for complacency with regard to macro performance, said George Osborne. He was keen to highlight potential dangers to further economic progress, stressing concern over external factors, including stuttering recovery in the Eurozone, the market for 50% of UK goods exported, and slower growth in emerging markets. So, obviously this stimulus material is written some time ago, maybe 18 months ago, when, for example, we hadn't yet had the result of the EU referendum. But just with regard to that particular paragraph, you'll know that AD is C to the I to the G to the X minus M plus X minus M. So George Osborne, they're citing external factors in Europe and emerging market economies. So the fact that, for example, growth rates in China are slowing, that type of thing. And the key points mentioned in the introductory section of the stimulus material with regard to some of the BRIC nations experiencing recession, that type of thing. Now, all of those factors will obviously impact primarily this little section here, is where we're looking to. So the net exports aspect, obviously a driver of growth, although not the biggest driver, obviously in the UK, the biggest driver being C, which is around 2/3 of the whole AD in the UK economy. But nonetheless, an important aspect of it, so one to be aware of. Moving on. Other potential risks include business uncertainty from the referendum, gosh how profound that statement is, which could compound entrepreneurial pessimism. So if people were reluctant post sort of Great Recession to start their own business, saying that the outcome of the EU referendum vote would possibly make that even worse, would compound it. Most surveys suggest that leaving the EU would have a negative impact on UK GDP. While investment has contributed to the growth of domestic demand, business pessimism prevails amongst manufacturers, casting doubt on the Chancellor's hopes of a march of the makers. So this is all hinting at really the I component of AD and what's likely to maybe happening to the investment section, the investment by firms in capital goods, that type of thing. And of course you'll know that I is important not only for AD growth, but investment is also important for the growth of the potential of the economy. Sorry, put my teeth in the next time. So we want AD shifting, maybe to AD2, but if we can also get AS shifting as well with investment and infrastructure projects, then rather than ending up here at B, we end up here at C, and you'll know that's called sustainable economic growth, where we are shifting both AD and AS in tandem. And why is that beneficial? Because we get the growth of real output, but we also keep a lid on the inflationary pressures into the economy. So important thought there. The government's plan to achieve a budget surplus by 2019-20 leave little room for expansionary fiscal policy should the growth of demand falter. Okay, that's a very important aspect of, indeed a very important aspect of government policy at the time. The whole plan here with regard to the fiscal deficit was to bring this into surplus by 2020. That was George Osborne and Nick Clegg's hopes in 2010. That, of course, as you know, Philip Hammond has abandoned that plan, certainly of the balance by 2020 anyway. But if you could get a budget surplus, that obviously means that your revenues coming in are greater than your outgoings in the form of government revenue, in the form of government spending, and that then enables you to start to pay down your debt. Well, what this is saying here is that when you're trying to cut your costs and to manage your budget and to bring the borrowing down, then there's no room for stimulus into the economy, because you're always thinking, oh well, yes, if I could spend money on that road project, but that is going to burst the budget. So it's a very important balancing act. If circumstances permit, there's a strong case for infrastructure investment, especially given long-term interest rates are low. So this is probably talking about long-term government debt and bond yields and so on and so forth, which are very low at the moment in the UK economy. And again, if you consult the back of your Economist magazine, you'll see that those are quite low. I can't remember off the top of my head what they are, but they may be around the sort of high, sort of 1.5 to 2%, something like that. So that's fiscal policy. Then, look, monetary policy. So what's monetary policy? Primarily base rate, as you know, the money supply, and in some instances you might be talking about quantitative easing as well, but let's see what it says here. Consistently low Bank of England base rate. Mark Carney, Governor of Bank of England, has made clear that a rise in interest rates is unlikely until the UK economy moves much closer to the inflation target. And you'll know from the extract further up, it says that the economy is not near that. Now, I think I have here, let me just double check, interest rates, yeah. So this is Trading Economics website, nice one again for just charting data. And this is the UK interest rate since 1971 through to the present day. So you can see how volatile it used to be. So when I was a kid growing up, the volatile rates here, and you know, look at that, sort of 1980, we're knocking on for 16–17%. Can you imagine if house buyers and homeowners today were having to pay that sort of interest rate? Most people would be homeless and they'd be defaulting on their mortgages and so on. So very high rates of interest, but let's consider today. So you'll know that as a result of the Great Recession, interest rates, base rates were brought down very, very quickly, very swiftly, in maybe 3 or 4 consecutive months, from about 5.25% down to the historic low of 0.5%, where they stayed for many, 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 many years. And now we have an all-time historic low once again of 0.25%. That, of course, being the Bank of England's response to the EU referendum outcome to reduce that to 0.25%. Whether or not that made any difference, of course, is another matter. And so this is where the base rate lies at the moment. So Governor Carney, Dr. Mark Carney, is saying that this is unlikely to be moving from this 0.25%, or probably at the time of writing, and relative to this extract, we're looking at the 0.5%. Now you'll know that that is, when we have very low base rates, that is known as a loose monetary policy rather than tight, and it's also expansionary, or in theory anyway, it's expansionary. The whole point being that if you have low base rates, then that will stimulate the interest rate sensitive components of expenditure, or of AD, so that would be stimulate C, stimulate I, and also get net exports growing via the interaction of the interest rate into the exchange rate into the real economy, the transmission mechanism as we refer to it. Okay, at present cost pressures are low, etc, etc. So remember, we've got our different types of inflation. We've got cost push, demand pull, and monetary inflation. So this is saying that cost push pressures are low. And moderating global growth is a drag on UK exports. So that is suggesting to us that in terms of costs, you know, our long-run aggregate supply curve here be shifting downwards, possibly, if costs are reducing. And also it's saying, well, AD, the sort of increasing pressures on AD, the pull pressures, pulling it to the right, those are moderating because of the factors identified in the introduction with regard to the fact that the emerging market economies, and Europe as well, our big trading partner, aren't buying as many of our exports, and so that's having a little, it's putting a little bit of a brake onto the export side of things. Furthermore, the Governor has argued that the unemployment rate, which fell to 5.1%, might mislead us with regard to the amount of slack in the economy, the output gap. Very important point, I feel, with regard to the exam, possibly. So, you'll know that the output gap is long-run aggregate supply, or KAS, YF. So if we were away down here at AD1Y1, you'll know that that distance there, that is referred to as the negative output gap, so the amount of unemployed resources in the economy. As AD moves around in this direction, we're moving towards capacity, towards full employment. We're close to that in the UK economy because 5.1% unemployment. Now, one would anticipate, and one would have thought, that that would be starting to deliver some upside inflationary pressures through wages, prices, and or both. But Mr. Carney is saying that this might this might not be a true reflection of the amount of capacity. So why might that be? Well, after the Great Recession, some people became so discouraged by the fact that they couldn't find work that they just withdraw themselves from the labour force. And so they're no longer participants in, and therefore measures of, the amount of unemployment. So although this is saying unemployment is 5.1%, actually in reality there could be tens of thousands of discouraged workers who, if required, if called upon, if the opportunities presented themselves, could very quickly move back into the labour force and hence create a little bit more slack in the economy and help to just ameliorate any upside inflationary pressures. The discouraged workers, a very important aspect, I think, of this particular analysis when we're talking about the amount of slack in the economy. Okay, and then let's get back to it. Might mislead us to the amount of slack in the economy. The other thing I guess to say is that the whole notion of maybe underemployment. So this is where people post Great Recession kept their jobs, but maybe instead of working 5 days a week, they're working 3. So they're working on a part-time sort of basis. Well, number one, they probably don't want to be doing that. And number two, if necessary, these people could move back into full-time hours, and that wouldn't necessarily generate any greater upside pressures into the economy in terms of wage and price inflation, because that additional capacity and that additional slack is already in the economy anyway. In short, a mixture of factors on both the demand and supply side are restraining inflationary pressure. Demand and supply side pressures. I'd be very surprised if you don't get some sort of analysis question here with regard to these sort of demand and supply side issues, the demand constraining factors and the supply side constraining factors. In light of the Chancellor's desire to rapidly reduce the budget deficit, as I've already shown you, it is as well that the bank governor, so that's Mark Carney, does not anticipate any rise in interest rates in the short run. Why would they say that? Well, if the fiscal policy can no longer be used as expansionary policy because you're trying to reduce it all the time, you're effectively taking your fiscal policy and you are tying it behind your back. And so therefore, in order to leverage the economy and in order to fire some ammunition at the economy, the only thing really that you've got left are twofold. Number one, you've got your monetary policy, and I mean, how much lower can we go than 0.25%? So we're already hitting that with the big ammo anyway. And supply side policies. Well, supply side policies, generally speaking, need a lot of funding, and we already know that this fiscal policy aspect is being withdrawn and constrained. So that makes the whole notion of having a very loose monetary policy all the more important, because were it not for that, from where would the expansionary ammunition be coming from in the economy? So that, ladies and gentlemen, is extract 1. In the next video, I will just take a look at extract 1 and we'll have a look and see what the likely questions might be for the exam. Stay tuned. Bye for now.